Welcome back to the letters John wrote. We're in the fourth chapter of the first letter. We've been learning a lot about God's love, and we've been learning about the importance of it in our lives and what it means to us in the way of salvation and in the way of living the Christian life. We're going to pick up in verse 15 of chapter 4. Whoever confesses that Jesus is the Son of God, God remains in him and he in him. And we're talking about this relationship of joint inhabitants. Verse 16. We have come to know and have believed the love which God has for us. God is love, and the one who remains in love remains in God, and God remains in him. He's bringing a little bit of the earlier part of the chapter back into this because he's setting the stage to bring a filter in place that we can understand God's love in us better. And so he repeats this aspect of God being the very essence of love. And of course that's sacrificial, unmeasurable, and unconditional love. He goes on to say, by this love is perfected in us so that we have confidence in the day of judgment. Because as he is, we also are in this world. Saying, when God's love is in us, we don't need to fear judgment. We don't need to fear God's wrath because God is here with us and God is in us and we are in God because of that great love that was expressed through his Son, Jesus Christ. Verse 18, there is no fear in love, but perfect love, God's love, drives out fear. Because fear involves punishment. There's that judgment aspect he talked about in the verse earlier. And the one who fears is not perfected in love. Now let's be quick to say the word perfected is not an event. It is not an instantaneous thing. That word in the Greek is a process word, being perfected. It is part of what we typically call sanctification. It's a process of drawing closer to God and reflecting more of the life of Christ. So consider it this way. You're either swimming in the mainstream of God's love and God's Spirit and God's light, or you're kind of sitting on the bank of that river. You haven't left it if you're a Christian, but if you're not being perfected and you're living in fear, and believe me, in our culture, that's very easy to do. People are scared to death of war. They're scared to death of disease. They're scared to death of running out of supply and not being able to live a life that they have lived. And none of this is promised to us by God. What we have to understand is God has promised to be with us. Because as he lives in us, he perfects us, he draws us closer to himself, even in the midst of adversity, disease, war, tribulation, whatever it is. It's sad because there's a lot of Christians that just want to get out. They just want to, if they can't have it their way, it's, take me now, Jesus. And that's not the way we should live. We should not live in fear of our government. We should not live in fear of disease. We should not live in fear of anything. War, famine, pestilence, persecution, anything. Because we have God living in us. And as we read earlier, greater is he who is in you than he who is in the world. And so this filter he brings in is that of understanding that God's perfect love being perfected in us leaves no room for us to live in fear. And so if you're living in fear, you're probably not out in the mainstream of God's life, and you're probably not being perfected or sanctified to the fullest measure that you could be. Fear is a choice, and you can choose to reject it. And I encourage you to do that. We'll pick up there in our next session.